Hi everyone, welcome to Sermon Notes. This week we're looking at Matthew chapter 13 and the middle section on our parables. They're kind of our three sections in Matthew 13 for parables. That first section is about the sower and the explanation of why Jesus speaks in parables in between Jesus giving the parable of the sower and explaining the parable of the sower. That's the first section. The second section is what we're looking at today, and that is the parable of the wheat and the weeds, which is also divided between Jesus giving the parable and then explaining the parable. And in the middle section, he gives two parables that are so similar, the parable of the yeast and the parable of the mustard seed. And so I'm doing this outside today in a little bit of a different way than what I've been doing sermon notes, because I'm choosing to be very visual in this sermon notes today in order to engage your imagination. The reason for that is because the parables were meant to engage people's imagination. It's very important for us to learn by using our imagination, and so we'll be doing that today with both visual outside here with me speaking and also with some photographs that we can look at. As we are then digging into the first parable today for the wheat and the weeds, we're looking specifically at a parable that is asking us to consider which one we are, one or the other. So let's look at this together. In the parable of the wheat and the weeds, Jesus is giving judgment to those who are considered to be the weeds. And in this way, Jesus is fulfilling his purpose of being a prophet. As we think about Jesus being both prophet, priest, and king, we see him here bringing prophecy to the people of Israel just as prophets of the Old Testament did. And it's not as though Jesus is trying to be like those prophets were in the Old Testament, but rather those prophets in the Old Testament were looking forward to the prophet Jesus. They were a type of what Jesus is and what he would be. Well, as we look at this prophecy then of judgment or indictment against Israel's leaders who were growing up like weeds around the wheat of those who are receiving the kingdom of heaven message, we have to remember that this has a bigger prophetic scope, as most prophecies, if not all prophecies, do. And that bigger prophetic scope is also for the church. So in the original context, that's our exegesis. It's definitely about the Pharisees, religious rulers, those who are, in fact, the weeds growing up around the wheat who refuse to hear the kingdom of heaven message and are, in fact, poisonous to the church, or poisonous rather to those who are receiving the good news. And the bigger scope is that one day the church will have to deal with this as well. That's pretty typical of prophecies, in this case, in this parable. Well, I think it's important to point out that the wheat that Jesus is referring to is obviously very familiar to his original audience and to us today as a most important and most stable and most needed plant on the planet. And at the same time, the specific weed he chooses to point out, zizania, or what we would call darnel. That weed is almost identical to wheat, and some pictures here will help us see the head of this is slightly different, but so hard when it's planted in and amongst all of the wheat, so hard to be able to tell the difference between them. And that point then being that Jesus is saying that there must be a time then to wait until the end of time, in which there will be a sorting out. I think it's also important for us to note in this parable that the already and not yet that we are living in right now is being described in this parable, isn't it? That the wheat and the weeds are both sown, one by Jesus, the other by the enemy, but they're both allowed to grow for a time. And then at the end of time, what we call the eschaton, or let's say when Jesus comes again, well, that is when the already but not yet will be finished, and we'll be able to see the completion of God's plan. Well, the parables of the mustard seed and the yeast certainly give imagination to just how small the seed is and how small the yeast is. And why would Jesus use such a small seed and purposely calling it the smallest of seeds? And then yeast being something that is so tiny, but then grows to something so large. And then why did Jesus then say that that's like the kingdom of heaven? Why is that his illustration of the kingdom of heaven? I think it's important to note that the context here for these parables for Matthew is that this is just following after John the Baptist's question of whether or not Jesus is the Messiah. And his question may have come because he was looking at Jesus' work and wondering to himself why Jesus is not bringing about the kingdom that was expected by Israel, a kingdom that would have been an all-at-once kingdom, not one that's waiting till the eschaton, waiting till the end, not one that allows the weeds to grow up at the same time, not one that's allowing the four soils, the three soils that are hard hearts, to be alongside of the soil that is good. So in this case, Jesus, by using a description of something so small that grows over time to something that's miraculously powerful and much more of a kingdom than you could ever possibly imagine, is his response to this question of that people may have had and John the Baptist may have had around why Jesus, as the Messiah, is not accomplishing the kind of kingdom that they had expected. An all-at-once power kingdom over the weeds and over the rulers of the world, such as the Herods and the Caesar, the Romans. So, the kingdom is something different. The kingdom is sown in secret, says Mark's gospel. The kingdom is small, easily overlooked. The growth is the mysterious work of God here. Well, that's the case with mustard seed, and that's the case with leaven, with our yeast parable. Initially imperceptible, but astonishing results. I think that's a way to be able to sum up those two parables, mustard seed and yeast. Initially imperceptible, astonishing results. Well, the kingdom of heaven may be ignored for now, is what Jesus is describing, but it will become impossible to ignore. And that certainly is the case for the work of Jesus Christ. And that certainly is the case of what happened with Jesus being planted within the ground and his death, and then his resurrection and kingdom work being built over time becomes something that is astonishing, something impossible to ignore. Well, there's a lot going on around here, a lot of sounds, a lot of people. There's been people walking by, and there's birds and sun's kind of coming in and out of the clouds. And I tried to bring in a little bit of imagery here of blackberry bushes that are similar in our context. All of this is important in our visual senses, in our ears, because Jesus is saying with these parables, he who has eyes to see and ears to hear, he let them see and let them hear. And so I want to encourage us today, as we think about these parables and what's going on, to have eyes to see and ears to hear.